If you were born in the 60s or 70s, I can pretty well guarantee that you were told this lie. I would love to know that I'm wrong. If you're a boomer like me or a Gen Xer, you most likely were raised to believe that being selfish was wrong. Selfish was a bad word. That meant you were bad. Maybe you even thought about it as evil. If you weren't taught this, please comment below, because the rest of us that were would love to hear from you. We'd love to learn what it was like to not be raised with that belief. But if you were raised, if you were conditioned to be good, to not be selfish, then this video is for you. Let me tell you, we were fed a lie. I want to prove to you how this belief that we trusted as truth has hurt us and is a dangerous myth to keep believing. I'm giving you my argument as to why you need to start being selfish. So now, because we were taught that it's wrong or bad to think of ourselves first, it's almost like we've become selfish-phobic. We're afraid to be perceived as selfish. And so we do things, we act in ways to be seen in a good light, to not be seen as selfish, to be perceived as good. I got a comment from a viewer on a recent YouTube video that I posted, and she is experiencing this feeling. What she said was, when is it okay to be selfish, and when do I help everyone else? She said, I find it so difficult to work out when to assert my needs and when to be generous to others. And this is part of the problem, is we feel like when we do for ourselves that we're doing wrong to others. It's like we've been led to believe that there can't be both. So it's black or white, it's either or. That is the dilemma that we've been put in by being taught that this word, selfish, is wrong. This book changed my life, Letting Go of Good by Andrea Mathews. And she says the definition of selfish. She said the good guy, she calls it the good guy, good girl. Their definition of selfish is anything that you do that references the self. Thinking about the self, taking care of the self, and even talking about the self are considered to be selfish. For the good guy or girl, the self is to be negated in the name of being there for others. This is a dangerous, I get goosebumps. This is a dangerous myth to believe, because we think if we're not doing for others, that we are being selfish, and that makes us bad. And we will therefore do anything to avoid being viewed as bad. We want to be viewed as the good girl. And that has led us into this habit of always putting ourselves on the back burner, never considering our own wants, needs, desires, dreams, goals. We're taught that we have to consider everyone else first. And then what ends up happening? There's no time or energy left for us. So we were taught by caregivers, by teachers, even by friends, by pastors, that we needed to sacrifice for others. We were told things like, the world doesn't revolve around you. Stop thinking only of yourself. Things like that, that led us to believe that if I thought of myself, that was wrong. And we were taught then to sacrifice and to be selfless. But I want you to consider, what is the meaning of selfless? If we think of other words that end in less, blameless, without blame, shameless, has no shame, breathless, doesn't have breath, careless, has no cares. And if we apply that to selfless, that means without self. So we were taught to put the emphasis on other people. And in an article in the Science Daily in 2017, they wrote, This could explain why many adults raised during these decades, the 60s and 70s, struggle with balancing personal needs against perceived obligations to others. So this perceived obligation to others, this caused us to suppress our emotions, our feelings, to not do and be who we truly wanted to be, because if we thought that those things weren't perceived as good, and a lot of feelings, emotions are perceived, we think are perceived as bad, we call them negative emotions like anger or sadness or frustration or resentment, right? So we end up suppressing those emotions so that we're not perceived as bad. And what ends up happening is then we suppress who we are. We are completely selfless. We are without self. So because of this, we end up with this striving to always be perfect, to prove ourselves. And how do we have a fun, joyful life when we can't even express what we feel, how we want to be, who we want to be in the world? How do we actually live a fun, joyful life when we aren't allowed to express ourselves because we're striving to be good and not be perceived as this bad, evil person? So why did I say at the beginning that this is a dangerous myth to believe? When we believe that we need to do whatever we can to avoid being perceived as selfish, we set ourselves up to be taken advantage of. We end up ignoring external signals of people who don't have our best interests at heart. We ignore our intuition. We're taught to ignore the intuition, that the intuition is just too woo-woo-y, right? We're taught to follow the rules. But who is setting these rules? Who's setting these standards about what is good and bad, right and wrong? Who sets these standards? It's someone else. And so if we're trying to live up to someone else's rules, how do we ever know whether we've met the mark? And so we are constantly looking outside of ourselves for external validation and whether or not we're meeting the mark. So we set ourselves up for people to take advantage of our time and energy. Are you the one that people rely on to get things done because you never say no? And so you end up getting a bunch of stuff piled on your plate because they know they can depend on you. That was me. Heidi will do it, right? And she'll do it well because I strived to be good, be seen in this positive light, that I would do these things. I didn't recognize, though, how I was setting myself up to be taken advantage of by people who will take advantage of you. And I also set myself up to be taken advantage of by a toxic person more than once, because I was always willing to give and give and give. Those type of people recognize the giver and they are the takers. And so they thrive on you continually giving. But it is very toxic and it can become literally a dangerous situation where you are in a situation that is not safe. I was constantly trying to behave in ways that I would be viewed as good. And I was trying to prove how good I could be, how likable I could be, how acceptable I could be. And that leads me to the second point of why this is a very dangerous myth to believe that we shouldn't be selfish. And that is that it keeps us in this cycle of proving our worth, proving our value. Again, if I'm trying to prove that I'm not bad, that I'm not wrong, then I'm constantly behaving in ways to prove that I'm good. This constant trying to prove ourselves diminishes our self-worth. Again, whose measurements are we using to know when I get to that place of being worthy, of being good enough? And so it's this constant cycle of trying to prove myself. It's just endless proving, endless seeking of something from outside of me that I will never get. Can you see yourself in either of these? Have you ever felt taken advantage of, or maybe even gotten yourself into a situation, a relationship that was toxic and maybe you didn't know how to get out? Or can you see yourself in the cycle of always wanting to prove yourself, to prove your value? This could be with a partner, with people at church, with friends, with bosses, with colleagues, trying to prove your value. I had to adjust myself for the sun is taking over. So how do we break out of this cycle of feeling guilty and selfish whenever we do something for ourselves? One of the first places to start, as I always say, is with awareness. When we do the worthless, blameless, careless, breathless, and we say that's without breath, without blame, without shame, they have no shame. Then when we apply that to selfless, without self, that means I don't exist and I don't want to feel that way. So looking and just shifting your own perspective on what it means, what selfish actually means. And in the book, Letting Go of Good, she says the term selfish actually serves no real purpose other than to manipulate. So we were told when we were young, stop being so selfish, right? In order to get us to comply. And she goes on to say then, it isn't selfish to think about the self, for how else will one become acquainted with the self if one doesn't think about it? And then she says, to act purely out of the self is how we live an authentic life. So thinking about it in that way, that to be selfish does not mean what we were conditioned or taught. And so if you want to tell yourself that it's okay to be selfish, it's okay if the meaning of selfish is to think only of yourself, then be selfish. I say be selfish. But that is truly not the meaning of it. And I don't want to live a life thinking that I'm selfless, because then that means I don't exist. And that takes away all the meaning of my life. And I know that I was put here. We all were put here with meaning. There is a purpose to all of our lives, to help and serve each other, but not to sacrifice ourselves for each other. So becoming aware of the programming, the stories that you were taught, that you were led to believe, that will help you start breaking free of this thought that selfish is wrong and bad and evil. And if you want to dive further into that, I invite you to join the 12 Days of Stressmas Challenge, which is starting Monday, December 2nd. Right here, it will be 12 days of short videos like this, where we'll be diving deeper into topics like this. How do we break free of always giving ourselves over to others? I would love to know what this video meant to you, what you got out of it, and leave a comment. Again, if you were someone who wasn't taught that selfish was bad, then please leave a comment. Let us know how that felt to grow up in a way not having this programming that selfish was a bad thing. Thanks for watching, commenting, and I'll see you in the next video. I got a comment from a recent YouTube video because let's see, just be natural.